Okay, any questions from the committee before we begin? Okay, great. Well then, Paul, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, I'd like to take a moment to sincerely thank my dissertation chair, Dr. Kress, for helping guide me in the development of this proposal. I'd also like to thank the full committee for being participants today and for helping guide my dissertation. I look forward to working with the entire committee today and as I pursue the completion of my research proposal and dissertation. So, and certainly thank you to Stephanie as well for all her work behind the scenes. So let's get going. I guess I should mention before I get too excited here, the title of my research study is Proposed Retention Intervention Program Success, an Inquiry into Learning Organization Structural and Cultural Elements in California Community Colleges. And the overview for today is pretty clear. I talk about the problem that frames this research, a brief review of the literature, explain the methodology, and certainly ask questions or allow questions and look for feedback today as well. So, as we probably all know on this call, community colleges are open access institutions, and we are responsible for providing access to higher education and workforce training to an increasingly diverse student population. And you can see some information there that's pretty important to note. 44% of all undergraduates nationally study at community colleges, and that includes 55% of Hispanic students, 44% of Black students, and only 41% of white students. And in California, 60% of all college-bound students, and that includes 81% of Hispanic males and 82% of Black males, study in community colleges. We also know that nationally, about 70% of those attending community colleges have family incomes less than $50,000. So we know we serve a very diverse student population. Community colleges really are responsible for providing economic mobility. Adults entering the workforce can no longer expect to gain and secure employment that pays a livable wage with only a high school diploma. The current workforce needs post-secondary credentials to achieve economic stability, and they are available in the form of vocational and technical certificates, associate degrees in community colleges, and obviously baccalaureate degrees as well. And we know that those with some college earn more than those without college. However, those with at least an AA degree earn more than those with some college but no AA. And certainly, those who earn an AA can then transfer and pursue baccalaureate degrees and advanced degrees. So we know that there's tremendous opportunity for students who start at community colleges. However, here's the problem. We see very poor completion and transfer rates for community college students, and you can see the statistics here. About 40% of community college students who pursue an AA degree or transfer as their goal achieve this goal within a 6-year period nationally. In California, that number is only 34% of students who intend when they enter to achieve a AA degree or to transfer. And when we start to think about that, we think, well, maybe it's just part-time students and that factors in. But if you look at the next statistic, 13% of students who start first-time, full-time in California achieve a 2-year degree in 2 years. And it takes 3 years to raise to 31% of first-time, full-time. So you see a developing challenge here. CCC 6-year completion rate, when you factor in certificates, degrees, achievement of 60 transferable units, is still less than 50%. And when we will look at students of color, that drops to 36%. So we have a significant challenge in terms of students being able to complete and transfer. To complete degrees and certificates and to transfer, obviously students must pass their classes. And again, we have a challenge here to address, a disproportionate impact. According to a 2014 Harrison Wood study of California community colleges, and males in particular, they noted that course passing rates vary widely. You can see the breakdown on the right. 70% of males pass their classes with a C or better. However, when you disaggregate that, you see that white males are almost passing at about 75%, but African-American males pass at the lowest rate of 58%. Clearly, providing students access to higher education without also providing them the support they need to succeed is not responsible. To complete degrees, certificates, and transfer, students also must persist from year to year, from term to term, and from year to year, fall to spring and fall to fall. However, persistence and retention rates remain relatively unchanged over the last 15 to 20 years, despite significant efforts to address them. Community colleges retain slightly more than 50% of students from fall to fall. For full-time students, that retention is about 60%. However, it's about 44% for full-time African-American students at community colleges compared to 70% at universities. So there's a gap there to address. Institutions of higher education, thankfully, are turning to technology to address some of these concerns. And that's also true of community colleges to address retention, persistence, completion. About 70% of institutions of higher education have early alert and intervention programs and platforms currently in place. Institutions are using technology to better track, nudge, and encourage students to stay on the path toward completing their educational goals. And researchers Harris and Wood, in that same research study I mentioned earlier, called for policymakers in California to implement a statewide early alert system in California community colleges as one of 10 policy recommendations. The community college system picked that up and decided to make some adjustments and some changes in their policies, and did look into implementing the Hobson Starfish Early Alert and Intervention Program as part of an initiative in 2015 through 2018. 43 of 116 community colleges are involved in that. However, Dr. Adriana Kizar has called those kinds of efforts, particularly when aimed at addressing equity gaps and supporting success outcomes of diverse students, as programitis, arguing that they do relatively little to increase the success of diverse students unless they are also considering and investigating the existing institutional structures and cultures for diverse student success. And that's something my dissertation focuses primarily on. And that gets us to the problem and purpose. So the purpose of this research proposal is to investigate California community colleges that have implemented EA&I programs, early alert programs, in order to understand the structural and cultural elements of the organizational learning culture, which contribute to the implementation and sustainment of retention intervention programs. And I believe a better understanding of how colleges are implementing and sustaining these programs and how the learning culture functions within these to support these efforts will help institutions more effectively implement programs or improve existing programs. So I now turn to a brief review of the literature. Chapter 2 in the dissertation proposal examines previous literature on student retention, early alert and intervention programs, organizational theories, and student affairs in relationship to both organizational theory and learning culture, or organizational learning culture. This chapter also discusses the theories of Bowman and Deal and Senge, which operate as frameworks, Bowman and Deal as the conceptual and Senge as the theoretical framework, to understand the issues and contexts of the study. So I'll start with the retention issue, literature on retention. Community colleges are facing increased pressure to improve student retention and completion. As noted, about 50% of community colleges lose students from fall to fall. They disappear. They don't transfer to another institution. They simply vanish, and we lose the opportunity to engage them and help them on their path. Vincent Tinto, as I think we all know, developed the student departure theory in 1975 to understand the causes of student attrition, and that model has been adapted and changed over time and added to. In 2016, with recent research, Tinto noted that students face significant internal and external obstacles in the path to completion. We all know about COVID and the impact that has had. However, self-efficacy is really critical for students to feel a sense of belonging and engagement with the institution. And that literature is becoming more prominent as we look at the retention concerns and issues. So unless students successfully complete their courses, they're unlikely to persist from term to term. And if they don't persist from term to term, and if institutions cannot retain them from first year to second year, they're less likely to complete a credential or a degree. And given the diverse student population who attend community colleges, Community colleges have a responsibility to decrease and eliminate the equity gaps between different socioeconomic student groups. That is their call and is the call to action in California community colleges right now. So, a common strategy to address retention is the development and implementation of early alert and intervention programs. And you can see the slide lays out a little information about EA&I. The goal of any EA&I program is to establish a formal proactive feedback structure to alert students and campus support agents to proactively address issues that are academic or socio-emotional in nature that are stopping the students from achieving success in the classroom. EA&I programs are currently in about 70% of two-year and nearly 80% of four-year institutions, both public and private. However, the question of how effective those EA&I programs is a cause for concern and is something I also talk about in the rest of my literature review. According to a 2017 survey, however, of public and private four-year institutions, EA&I programs was noted as one of the most used and most effective initiatives for student retention and completion. While research on retention in higher ed is extensive, the literature focused on EA&I programs is still relatively limited. However, that is changing as we begin to implement more and more technology-based systems, and we're seeing more dissertations and more research being done on those various areas. There are some common themes of note in EA&I literature. First is the positive impact of EA&I on student retention and/or student success. Also, the impact of EA&I on connecting students to support is another common theme, tutoring, for example, or counseling. Certainly, EA&I integration with other technology systems is probably some of the more common research over the last 10 years. And finally, there is limited research on effective practices in EA&I. And that involves things like developing proactive early notifications of issues, positive messaging to students, identifying the target population, defining the intervention. However, there is a lack of robust literature in this area, which my dissertation proposes to address through a different lens of cultural and structural elements. Turn now to organization theory. As noted by Shine and Manning, organizational theory has been studied by sociologists and anthropologists and those in political science, education, business, psychology, and other areas for probably more than 50 years and has resulted in many models and many definitions of culture. I've selected this as some thinking points from the review. Organizational culture really is that social and normative glue that holds an organization together. That seems to be a relatively common understanding of that. It's also the deeply embedded patterns of organizational behavior and those shared values that institutions have that all members of the organization share in terms of their work. Scholars study the importance of organizational culture broadly across companies and institutions, but also more specifically in terms of institutions like higher education. And Manning and Birnbaum noted that the complexities of institutions of higher ed in particular really require the use of multiple theories to fully examine and understand practices and approaches. And my literature survey, my literature search and my brief review of literature covers quite a bit of that in chapter 2. I want to mention the structural elements of organizational theory. This is really important, I think, to the crux of my research proposal. Institutions of higher ed are very hierarchical, as we all know. And Manning has noted that there are really 5 structural characteristics that make them different from other types of organizations. And they include things like having a highly educated professional employee workforce, kind of like hospitals. But there are loyalties and allegiances that extend beyond the institution to professional organizations in discipline areas, for example, or student affairs versus academic affairs areas. There are also micro-organizational structures, unions, departments, disciplines that are at play within larger organization structures. There's often a difficulty in defining the specific product of higher education. And finally, there are often multiple conflicting roles between students, faculty, staff, administration, external constituencies that create a really complex set of structural characteristics in higher education. Higher education also are, IHEs really are professional bureaucracies with very clear lines of structural authority. However, despite clearly established and delineated hierarchies, organizational charts, there is a considerable decentralization within the professional bureaucracy. Because of their expertise, those at the base of the institutional structure, like faculty, for example, or advisors and counselors in student affairs, have significant power over what actually occurs and is accomplished within an organization. The bureaucracy also allows members to function relatively coherently, even within a very large, complex institution of hundreds or even thousands of employees, often on a single campus. However, there is also very significant decentralization despite a clear hierarchy. Those at the base, faculty in particular, have a very strong influence over culture and the enculturation and onboarding of new faculty. So the structure of the professional bureaucracy also has its faults. The structure can create problems with coordination and standardization of skills. As we know, as a former faculty member, I can attest to this. Organizational members, particularly faculty in the name of academic freedom, often resist supervision and standardization of practices, even if those practices are research-based. And secondly, problems of discretion occur, as not all professionals within this organizational structure are neither equally conscientious nor adequately competent, despite efforts to ensure effective evaluation and hiring and employee review. There's still discrepancies there. Those most in need of professional development are often those who are hardest to convince of its value. And finally, perhaps most importantly in terms of the implementation of student retention strategies and practices, is the problem of innovation. The organizational structure of professional bureaucracy is really well suited to producing the outcomes it's already producing, as opposed to innovating and being entrepreneurial. I also want to turn my attention now to culture. And the cultural elements of institutions of higher education. And Bergquist, as you probably are familiar with, identified 4 distinct types of cultures that are found in institutions of higher education: collegial, managerial, developmental, or advocacy cultures. And you can see the notes indicate where those tend to be found most often. Collegial, advanced 4-year research institution, managerial and community colleges. Developmental is a combination of collegial and managerial, but also lends itself towards learning cultures as well. And advocacy tends to be more prevalent in community colleges, or where collective bargaining is particularly strong at an organization. Also connected to organization, while all cultural elements, while all organizations may have a distinctly dominant culture, it's not monolithic. There are smaller subcultures within a larger culture. Higher education has these subcultures, and they can have conflicting values. Math versus English, for example, on our campus often have very different values in terms of how they approach student success. Substructures can exist between faculty and administration as well as academic programs. And often institutional members can demonstrate adherence to the attitudes, beliefs, values of their subculture, which may conflict with the larger culture of the institution. Those subcultures and the culture obviously are intricately connected to student success on any campus. And as Tierney noted, in order to orchestrate change that involves or impacts faculty, including the implementation of EA&I programs, those leading those efforts must understand the contradictions between various cultures if meaningful implementation is to occur. So we're going to finish with organizational theory, looking at student affairs. No single organizational model exists for student affairs. And minimal structural change has occurred within student affairs areas really for the last 50 years. However, student affair leaders are learning to shift and adapt, becoming more dynamic and process-oriented, particularly as they're facing challenges both internally and externally. Institutions are starting to reorganize to ensure more cross-functional collaboration and communication between student affairs, for example, and academic affairs. This is particularly true in the implementation of EA&I programs. It's very unlikely that student affairs is owning that process entirely. They may be leading it, but they must work with academic affairs to implement and develop those programs. Lastly, learning organizations. This is a part of the research questions, as you'll see shortly. The concept of learning organizations is intertwined with organizational culture. They're very closely connected. A learning organization is really a practice-based, positively oriented, and focused on idealized concepts and behaviors like adaptability and flexibility, tolerance for risk, inquiry. A learning organization is one in which the culture of learning is promoted. Community of learners is developed. The individual's learning is enhances the greater mission of the college. IHEs, however, are not necessarily learning organizations just because they're institutions of higher education. It might appear that they'd be perfect incubators, but remember, professional bureaucracies, we are very hierarchical. They're neither structurally arranged nor culturally oriented to do so. They may teach a curriculum that espouses the tenets of learning organization, but they wrestle to figure out how to become them. And finally, student affairs as learning organizations. I'll just briefly mention this because of time, but I did look at student affairs as learning organizations, and perhaps of any culture on a campus, they probably are more able to adapt or see themselves as learning organizations. And you can see some of the rationale for why, just in the very nature of the work that they do in working with students. And certainly they have begun to embrace the ideas of learning organization and apply those principles, but there's not yet been a large-scale adoption. And I'll refer down to Croft, former student of Portland State, and her finding that where student affairs within institutions do demonstrate a learner-centric environment and embrace those principles and enact the practices of a learning organization, program implementation tends to be more successful. And this leads to the conceptual framework for the study. First, Bowman and Deal's 4 frames will be used as the conceptual framework, providing a guide to examine how institutions have achieved EA&I program implementation and sustainment. The interview protocol, as I'll talk about in just a few minutes, and questions of the study are designed to explore and answer the research questions and gather data focused on each of those 4 frames: structural, human resource, political, and symbolic. They are all at play within an organization, and leaders and those studying higher education really need to understand the importance of these 4 frames. Kezar noted that this model is one of the most comprehensive overviews of organizational theory and its implications available for researchers and practitioners, which is one of the reasons why I chose this model. I'll also use a theoretical framework, Senge's learning organizational model, particularly to look at the second research question. Senge's model will be used as this model when examining this question: how does student services and student affairs areas support a learning-centered environment? You'll see that in just a moment. So the interview protocol and the focus of my research really is around these 5 disciplines of the learning organization as identified by Senge: shared vision of all members, personal mastery, systems thinking, team learning, mental models. And so the questions are devised and arranged around that 5-discipline framework. So, summary of literature. Again, I focus on student persistence, retention, and completion, and identify that there are problems in community colleges as a result of that literature search and review. Early alert and intervention programs do offer a solution. Literature on best practices for implementing EA&I programs is limited. Examining structural and cultural elements of learning organizations may provide information on how to improve implementation and sustainment of those programs. And that leads to the methodology. And if I could take a quick drink of a water right now, I'd appreciate that. So the methodology. There are 2 fundamental questions I'm looking at in this research. Question number 1. I want to explore the structure and cultural elements. The question is, what structural and cultural elements of organizational learning culture support the implementation of early alert and intervention programs? So I want to look at that using primarily Bowman and Deal's framework to do so, but also elements of Senge. And then certainly the second research question: how does the student services, student affairs, they're called different terms in different institutions. In California, they're called student service areas, support a learning-centered environment as an essential characteristic of initiating and sustaining an early alert and intervention program. And again, the theoretical model of Senge is used for learning organizations for that question. The study design. Here's the design of the proposed study. First of all, it's a basic qualitative study. And qualitative research, as we know, is most helpful in producing knowledge under a constructivist paradigm, as this method provides an opportunity for both the researcher and the participants to join in discovering, interpreting, constructing meaning concerning a phenomenon. So I'm proposing that as the methodology. And also 90-minute interviews as the data source. So those are the basic elements of the study design, and I'll give more detail about each of those interviews in just a moment. So the population. Institutions who meet 2 success criteria will be selected for this. And the 2 success criteria are as follows. First of all, full implementation of an EA&I program. And second of all, demonstration of success in one of these areas, retention, persistence, or completion. So those 2 areas are being identified as the criteria needed for an institution to become a part of this research study. And then for each institution that is selected, 4 participants from a target of at least 5 different institutions, so 20 participants total, would be part of that interview. And I'll talk more about that in just a moment. Sampling method, this will use a purposive, deliberate identification of those with insight into the phenomenon. So those 4 participants from 5 different institutions. The participants will be selected from 4 distinct levels within student affairs. A vice president or executive that oversees the implementation and sustainment of an EA&I program. The dean that has day-to-day or more direct oversight of the program. A staff member who functions within that program, and that's often a person that helps run the technical, but also a liaison perhaps between student affairs and other areas will also be a part of that. And then finally, a counselor or advisor, somebody from student affairs that works closely in the operation and the implementation of that. And the goal is 1 from each level from each institution. The study site is California community colleges who have implemented Starfish as an EA&I platform. So that list will be used primarily. And the goal, again, is to find at least 5 institutions willing to participate who meet that success criteria, full implementation of the program, demonstration of success. If more are willing to participate, then the site list could be expanded to include 1 as a pilot test and the remaining as research participants. So that is one of the things that I've proposed. The interviews, I propose a semi-structured approach. I would use a general success question to begin, and that's in the interview protocol in the dissertation proposal, but to essentially identify what do they believe has been the most successful element of their implementation. So start with kind of a softball question, start the ball rolling, and then start to ask structural and cultural questions in order. Structure first, followed by cultural questions, using Volman and Deal primarily, but also overlaid with Senge. And then organizational learning culture and student services. There's a section in the protocol that involves questions specifically about organizational learning culture. And again, 4 participants from each institution, 90-minute interviews, and the goal of the pilot, which would be useful in testing the questions, and I determine if the length of time is appropriate and use the data collected as part of the research. You can see sample research questions in the box on the right. For example, what structural and cultural elements of organizational learning culture support? That's a reminder of what that question is. Second question, how does the student affairs area support a learning-centered environment? And then the interview protocol below that shows, for example, the structural frame, a question related to that. What elements of organizational structure have been essential to EA&I program implementation and development? And then also a question about the political frame, which blends into system thinking as well. What were your biggest successes in the implementation of the program? What has not been as successful, and what did you do to address that? So leaning towards political frame in that. Data collection and analysis, as I wrap up, Interviews and transcripts obviously are the primary source of data, and obviously developing research memos and keeping a journal is part of what I've proposed to keep track of those interviews and transcripts. Certainly developing a document review process in which I contextualize the interview notes. Sources will include committee meeting agendas as well, minutes, email communication. So the goal here is simply to contextualize the interview notes, to make sense of some of the notes that I might be receiving as I conduct the interviews. And then certainly using intuition. And this blends into the positionality that I've explained in the research prospectus as well as one element of a source of data. Analysis. Analysis will be simultaneous and ongoing throughout the data collection process to identify those promising patterns and themes that become apparent. And obviously, I'd be reading and memoing the data. That will be done throughout the analysis process to code the data to identify and sort emerging and emergent themes. I plan to start with potential provisional a priori codes that will be developed in advance of the interviews, and then certainly in vivo codes that occur during the interviews that become apparent as the information emerges. So those two types of codes as analysis. So in summary, again, the main problem the study addresses is the effectiveness of the implementation of the Starfish Early Alert programs in California community colleges to determine which practices work well, perhaps which should be avoided. The proposed qualitative study provides an opportunity to complete an in-depth examination of the implementation of EA&I programs, focused specifically on organizational learning culture that supports that implementation. It does also address a gap in the literature. The research addresses a gap specific to practices that help implement and sustain retention programs, specifically early alert and intervention programs. Little is really understood about the structural and cultural elements that contribute to the implementation and sustainment of those programs. Importance. I believe the study will contribute to the increasing body of knowledge on EA&I programs and institutional retention strategies in community colleges. And the study will also add to the literature on organizational learning culture and connect that phenomenon specifically to student retention efforts. And the goal is a better understanding of how colleges are implementing and sustaining these programs and how the learning culture functions within these institutions to support institutional efforts. My goal is also I'm hopeful this will help institutions more effectively implement new programs and improve existing programs. And with that, I want to thank you for the whirlwind tour of my proposal and look to questions and feedback. And I forgot to hit the timer as I started, so I did it late, so I'm not sure how I did.